On a crisp spring morning in 482 BC, a crowd gathered in the Athenian agora, the beating heart of the ancient city. They came not for commerce, not for debate, and not for a festival. They came to perform a peculiar, silent act of democratic violence. Among the thousands pressing against the wooden barricades was an illiterate peasant. According to the biographer Plutarch, this man, struggling to participate in the ritual, stopped a passing aristocrat and asked for help. He handed the stranger his pottery shard, his ostracon, and asked him to write down the name Aristides. The stranger was surprised. He asked, "Has Aristides ever injured you?" The peasant replied, "No, I do not even know him. But I am tired of hearing him everywhere called the Just." The stranger said nothing. He simply took the shard, etched his own name, Aristides, onto the clay, and handed it back. That day, Aristides the Just, a war hero and statesman, was banished from Athens for 10 years. He had committed no crime. He had broken no law. He was simply too popular, too capable, or perhaps too annoying to the majority. This was the paradox of the Golden Age. We often view Athens as the cradle of liberty. But to protect that liberty, the Athenians built a machine designed to destroy the rights of the individual. This documentary examines the institution of ostracism, its origins, its ritualistic execution, and what its eventual failure tells us about the fragility of democratic systems. To understand ostracism, we must first strip away our modern judicial assumptions. In the modern West, punishment follows a crime. A law is broken, a trial is held, a sentence is passed. But in 5th century Athens, ostracism was not a criminal penalty. It was a political procedure. It carried no shame, no atimia. The victim's property was not confiscated. Their family was not stigmatized. They were simply required, by the will of the people, to leave Attica for 10 years. Scholars have long debated the true function of this institution. Was it a safety valve to prevent civil war? Was it a weapon for the jealous masses to cut down the tall poppies? Or was it, as some historians suggest, a ritual of negative election? A way for the demos to assert their ultimate sovereignty over the elite? For the next 40 minutes, we will explore the anatomy of this political weapon. We will look at the physical evidence, the thousands of pottery shards excavated from the Kerameikos, which reveal a story of organized corruption that rivals any modern ballot stuffing scandal. We will analyze the tragic careers of men like Themistocles and Cimon, heroes who saved Western civilization only to be cast out by the very people they saved. But to understand the ostracon, we must first understand the terror that created it. We must look to the year 508 BC, and a city hauntingly afraid of the return of kings. Athens in the late 6th century was a state recovering from trauma. For decades, the city had been under the thumb of the Peasant, a family of tyrants. While the word tyrant in Greek did not necessarily imply cruelty, it implied unconstitutional power. It meant that one man stood above the law. The history of the Peasant reveals much about why ostracism would later seem necessary. Peisistratos himself first seized power in 561 BC through a combination of populist appeal and armed force. According to Herodotus, he staged a fake assassination attempt, wounding himself and his mules, then appeared before the assembly demanding bodyguards for protection. The people, sympathetic to his apparent danger, granted him a personal guard. With these armed men, Peisistratos seized the Acropolis and declared himself tyrant. This pattern would repeat throughout his career. He was expelled twice and returned twice, each time with foreign mercenaries and the support of rival aristocratic families. The lesson was clear to any Athenian who lived through this period. Charismatic individuals, given enough resources and popular support, could overthrow democratic institutions almost at will. When Peisistratos died in 527 BC, his sons Hippias and Hipparchos inherited his tyranny. Their rule became increasingly paranoid and oppressive. especially after Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 B.C. by the tyrannicides Harmodios and Aristogiton. Hippias responded with a reign of terror, executing suspected conspirators and confiscating property from wealthy families he deemed threats. It took foreign intervention to finally expel the tyrants. The Spartan king Cleomenes invaded Attica in 510 BC and besieged the Peisistratids on the Acropolis. When the tyrants' children were captured trying to flee, Hippias negotiated safe passage out of Athens in exchange for their return. The age of tyranny was over, but its shadow remained. When the aristocracy, led by Cleisthenes, finally expelled the tyrants and established the radical experiment of democratia, they were faced with a structural problem. The old aristocratic families were still wealthy, powerful, and ambitious. Any one of them could, with enough charisma and mercenaries, seize control and dismantle the new constitution. Cleisthenes himself came from the powerful Alcmaeonid family, a clan that had been instrumental in overthrowing the tyrants, but was also suspected of harboring tyrannical ambitions. The political situation was delicate. How could the new democracy protect itself from its own protectors? How could it prevent the very men who had power and influence from using that power to destroy the system? According to Aristotle in his Constitution of the Athenians, Cleisthenes devised ostracism specifically to target the friends of the tyrants. It was intended as a preemptive strike. In a society without a supreme court or a rigid constitution, the people needed a mechanism to remove a politician who had become too powerful before he could overthrow the state. This is the crucial distinction. Ostracism was not about what a man had done. It was about what he might do. It was a judgment of character and potential influence. It assumed that concentrated power, even in virtuous hands, posed an existential threat to collective liberty. The philosopher and historian Moses Finley, in his work Democracy Ancient and Modern, published in 1973, argued that ostracism represented the Athenian solution to what political scientists call the paradox of tolerance. A tolerant society must be intolerant of those who would destroy tolerance itself. Similarly, a democratic society must have mechanisms to suppress those who would use democratic freedoms to establish tyranny. However, the weapon sat unused for nearly 20 years. It wasn't until 487 BC, 2 years after the Battle of Marathon, that the Athenians finally pulled the trigger. Why the delay? Perhaps the immediate threat of Persian invasion kept the city united. Or perhaps the sheer novelty of the weapon made the citizenry hesitant to use it. But once the seal was broken, ostracism became a regular feature of Athenian political life. The first victim was Hipparchus, son of Charmos, a relative of the former tyrant Hipparchus. His ostracism sent a clear message. The city would no longer tolerate even the family connections to tyranny. The democratic revolution was consolidating, and anyone associated with the old regime was vulnerable. Between 487 and 417 BRC, at least 10 men were ostracized, though scholars debate the exact number based on fragmentary evidence. What's clear is that ostracism became part of the normal political toolkit, a way to resolve factional disputes that might otherwise have led to civil war or coup attempts. The mechanism of ostracism was deliberate, cumbersome, and bureaucratic. It was designed to prevent heat-of-the-moment mob violence. It was a two-stage process that required the sustained will of the electorate. It began in midwinter, during the 6th Prytany, or month, of the civil year. The assembly, the ecclesia, would meet and vote on a single preliminary question. Do we wish to hold an ostracism this year? This preliminary vote is crucial to understanding the system's design. It wasn't automatic. Every year, the citizens had to consciously decide whether the political situation warranted using this extreme measure. This prevented ostracism from becoming routine or trivial. It forced the demos to evaluate whether factionalism had reached dangerous levels. No names were mentioned at this stage. It was a vote on the state of the city. If the people felt the political temperature was too high, or factionalism was threatening stability, they voted yes. If the vote passed, the actual ostracism would be scheduled for the 8th Prytany, roughly 2 months later. This cooling-off period is significant. It allowed for campaigning, for alliances to be formed, and for the city to debate exactly who was the source of their anxiety. Political factions could mobilize their supporters. Wealthy patrons could finance propaganda campaigns. The entire city became consumed with the question of who deserved exile. According to the historian P.J. Rhodes, in his commentary on Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians, published in 1981, this 2-month period transformed ostracism from an impulsive act into a calculated political strategy. Candidates for exile knew they were being targeted. They could attempt to rally support, redistribute wealth to gain popularity, or even voluntarily exile themselves to avoid the humiliation of formal banishment. When the day arrived, the voting did not happen on the Nix, but in the Agora. The procedure was highly ritualized. A large area was fenced off with wooden planks and divided into 10 entrances, one for each of the 10 tribes of Athens. This tribal organization was itself a Clisthenic innovation designed to break up old aristocratic power bases. By dividing the city into 10 artificial tribes that cut across traditional family and regional loyalties, Clisthenes ensured that no single clan could dominate any tribe. The ostracism procedure reinforced this tribal identity, making citizens vote as members of their democratic tribe rather than as clients of aristocratic patrons. Citizens would enter through their tribal gate. They carried with them a sherd of pottery, waste material from broken vases or roof tiles, ubiquitous in the ancient world. On this sherd, they scratched the name of the man they wished to banish. The choice of pottery as voting material was both practical and symbolic. Athens was filled with broken pottery. The city's potter's quarter, the Kerameikos, he produced thousands of vessels daily. Broken sherds littered streets, dumps, and construction sites. They were free, accessible to even the poorest citizen. But the ostracon also carried symbolic weight. It was a fragment, a broken piece of something that once had function and beauty. To write a man's name on such a fragment was to suggest that he too was broken, no longer fitting properly into the civic whole. It was a material metaphor for the fragmentation ostracism caused in the political community. The 9 archons and the Council of 500 presided over the event. For the ostracism to be valid, a quorum was required. Most scholars, basing their view on Plutarch and Philochorus, believe that 6,000 total votes had to be cast. If fewer than 6,000 citizens participated, the ostracism was void. This quorum requirement is debated among historians. Some scholars, including Raphael Seeley in his 1976 work, A History of the Greek City-States, argue that 6,000 votes had to be cast against a single individual, not just 6,000 votes total. This interpretation would make ostracism much more difficult to execute, requiring massive consensus against one person. However, the majority view, supported by Plutarch's account of the Aristides ostracism, suggests the 6,000 was a total participation requirement. This made more sense as a democratic safeguard. If fewer than 6,000 citizens cared enough to participate, the issue wasn't serious enough to warrant exile. If the quorum was met, the votes were sorted. The man with the plurality of votes, not necessarily a majority, just the most names, was banished. This plurality system had profound implications. In a field of multiple candidates, a man could be exiled with only 20 or 30% of the vote if the opposition was divided. This created strategic incentives for political alliances and backroom deals, as we'll see in the Hyperbolus affair. He had 10 days to settle his affairs. Then, he had to leave. If he returned before the 10 years were up, the penalty was death. These 10 days reveal the non-criminal nature of ostracism. The exile wasn't arrested or imprisoned. He was simply required to leave voluntarily. He could sell property, arrange business affairs, say goodbye to family. The state trusted him to comply, because refusing would transform his status from political exile to criminal fugitive, subject to execution if caught. The 10-year period itself was precisely calculated. It was long enough to remove someone from immediate political influence, but short enough to allow eventual return. Unlike permanent exile or execution, ostracism acknowledged that circumstances might change. The man dangerous in one political context might be valuable in another. For centuries, our understanding of this process relied on literary sources. But in the 1930s, excavations in the Kerameikos, the Potter's Quarter and Cemetery of Athens, uncovered a startling reality. Archaeologists found a deposit of thousands of ostraca dumped as fill for a road. These shards told a story that Plutarch never mentioned. Among the thousands of ballots cast against Themistocles, researchers found a specific group of 190 shards. They were written in just 14 distinct handwritings. This discovery, published by Eugene Vanderpoel in the journal Hesperia in 1970, revolutionized our understanding of Athenian democracy. The romantic image of independent citizens, each carefully writing their choice, had to be revised. What we see instead is organized political machinery operating at industrial scale. This physical evidence shatters the romantic illusion of the independent, thoughtful citizen scratching a name in private contemplation. Instead, it suggests that political factions were mass-producing pre-written ballots. These party cadres would stand outside the agora, handing out shards to illiterate or indifferent voters, effectively ballot stuffing on an industrial scale. Let's examine what this means in practice. Imagine you're an Athenian citizen in 471 BC. You know an ostracism is scheduled. You might have opinions about Themistocles, but you're busy. You have fields to tend, or you're a craftsman with orders to fill. Politics is important, but it's not your full-time occupation. As you approach the agora, you encounter well-dressed men, probably retainers of wealthy aristocrats, offering you pottery shards. Vote against Themistocles, they urge. He's become too arrogant, too powerful. He threatens the democracy. They hand you a shard with his name already neatly inscribed. You might accept it. Why not? Writing isn't your strong suit. The argument sounds reasonable. Or perhaps you're illiterate entirely, as many Athenian citizens were. You depend on others to write for you. The pre-written shard solves your problem. This paradox, using a democratic tool via undemocratic manipulation, reveals the sophistication of Athenian political machinery. The Peasant and Aristides story we began with might have been a charming anecdote, but the reality was likely a party operative shoving a pre-written shard into the peasant's hand. The archaeological evidence suggests something even more systematic. According to Sarah Forsdyke in her 2005 book, Exile, Ostracism, and Democracy, the distribution of handwriting styles on surviving ostraca indicates the existence of what we might call political parties or factions. These weren't formal organizations with membership roles, but they were coherent groups with leaders, resources, and coordinated strategies. Wealthy aristocrats would finance these operations. They'd purchase pottery shards in bulk, hire scribes to write names uniformly, and deploy agents to distribute them. This required planning, funding, and organization. It was political campaigning, 5th century BC style. We also find names on these shards that never appear in our history books. Calixanos, son of Aristonomos. Hippocrates, son of Alcmeonides. These men were candidates for exile who have been erased from history, likely because they lost the negative election and remained in Athens. Their political careers quietly ended by the threat, or simply forgotten because they didn't win the dubious honor of banishment. This reveals another function of ostracism: deterrence. For every man actually exiled, dozens more moderated their behavior to avoid becoming targets. The threat of ostracism shaped political culture even when it wasn't used. Ambitious politicians had to calculate whether their actions would make them vulnerable. In this sense, the ostracism worked most effectively when it didn't happen. The ostraca also serve as a window into the raw emotions of the ancient voter. They didn't just write names. Some added epithets. One shard targeting Aristides calls him the brother of Datis. Datis being the Persian general at Marathon. It was a slander, calling him a traitor. Another shard against a man named Cimon depicts him with a chaotic, ugly drawing. These personal insults reveal the visceral nature of Athenian politics. Democracy wasn't a polite, reasoned debate. It was passionate, personal, often vicious. The Ostracon gave ordinary citizens a chance to directly attack the powerful, to wound their reputations, even if they didn't succeed in exiling them. One particularly fascinating Ostracon, discovered in 1966, bears the name Themistocles, with the added insult, "Let him take his meddling mother too." This wasn't political philosophy. It was raw contempt, the kind of personal attack that transcends centuries. It reminds us that ancient Athenians, for all their philosophical sophistication, could be just as petty and vindictive as any modern electorate. These artifacts are not just votes. They are crystallized anger. They are 2,500-year-old tweets, encapsulating the vitriol of the political moment. The comparison to modern social media isn't frivolous. Both ostracism and online shaming involve public judgment by mass opinion without formal due process. Both allow ordinary people to participate in taking down the powerful. Both can be manipulated by organized groups with resources. And both reveal the dark side of democratic participation, the pleasure people take in collective condemnation. Who were the men who fell victim to this system? They were rarely villains. In fact, the list of ostracized Athenians reads like a hall of fame of the Golden Age. Consider Themistocles. This was the visionary who convinced Athens to build the wooden wall of ships that defeated the Persian navy at Salamis. Without Themistocles, Athens would have burned, and Greek democracy would likely have been extinguished. Themistocles' career demonstrates the complexity of Athenian political life. In 483 BC, when a massive silver strike was discovered in the mines at Lorient, the assembly debated how to use the windfall. The traditional approach would have been to distribute the silver equally among all citizens, giving each man a small bonus. Themistocles argued instead for investing the entire sum in naval construction. According to Herodotus, he didn't frame this as preparation for war with Persia. Instead, he argued Athens needed a larger navy to defeat their Greek rival Aegina. The assembly agreed, and Athens built 200 triremes, the warships that would save Greece. This decision reveals Themistocles' political genius. He understood that Athenians might resist spending on hypothetical Persian threats, but they would support defeating a nearby enemy. He also understood that naval power meant political power for the lower classes who rowed the ships, shifting Athens' political center of gravity away from the landed aristocracy. When Xerxes invaded Greece in 480 BC, it was Themistocles who interpreted the Delphic oracle's cryptic advice about wooden walls to mean ships, not defensive barriers. It was Themistocles who engineered the Greek naval victory at Salamis by luring the Persian fleet into narrow straits where Greek tactics could prevail. Yet, around 471 BC, he was ostracized. Why? Thucydides tells us that Themistocles had become arrogant. He walked with a heavy step. He reminded the Athenians too often of what they owed him. In a radical democracy, gratitude has a short shelf life. Themistocles' banishment illustrates a core tenet of Athenian psychology, phthonos, or envy. But it was also a rejection of the great man theory of history. By banishing their greatest hero, the Athenians were stating clearly, the city saves itself. No individual is necessary. This psychological dynamic is crucial to understanding ostracism. The Greeks recognized envy as a powerful political force. Plutarch, in his essay on envy and hate, describes how exceptional virtue provokes resentment rather than admiration. The man who stands too far above his fellows becomes unbearable, a living reproach to everyone else's mediocrity. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of anthropologist Julian Pitt Rivers on Mediterranean honor cultures, helps us understand this mentality. In societies where honor is a zero-sum game, one man's excessive glory diminishes everyone else. Themistocles' constant reminders of his service weren't just annoying, they were socially aggressive, claiming honor that rightfully belonged to the collective. Themistocles died in exile, in the court of the Persian king, the very enemy he had defeated. A tragic irony that seems to define the era. His final years are worth examining. After his ostracism, Themistocles first went to Argos, a Greek city-state. But his enemies in Athens, particularly his rival Cimon, accused him of plotting with Sparta's enemies to betray Greece. The Spartans demanded his extradition for treason. Fleeing from city to city, Themistocles eventually made his way to Persia. According to Thucydides, the Persian king Artaxerxes received Themistocles warmly. He gave him 3 cities in Asia Minor to govern and provide him with revenue. Themistocles lived out his days in comfortable exile, honored by the very empire he had once helped defeat. Some sources claim he committed suicide by drinking bull's blood rather than lead Persian forces against Greece. Other sources suggest he died of natural causes. Either way, the man who saved Greek democracy died in Persian territory, a guest of autocracy. The tragedy isn't just personal, it's civilizational. Athens threw away its greatest strategic mind because that mind had become inconvenient to collective ego. Then there was Cimon, the son of the hero Miltiades. Cimon was the opposite of Themistocles, an aristocrat, wealthy, pro-Spartan. He was ostracized in 461 BC for his disastrous foreign policy regarding Sparta. Cimon's career illustrates the factional nature of Athenian politics. While Themistocles represented the naval democratic faction, Cimon led the aristocratic conservative faction. He was fabulously wealthy, spending his fortune on public works and private charity to build political support. According to Plutarch, Cimon tore down the fences around his estates so that anyone could freely take fruit from his orchards. He employed a retinue of well-dressed young men who would give their cloaks to any poorly dressed elderly citizen they encountered in the agora. This wasn't mere generosity. It was systematic political patronage, building networks of obligation and gratitude. Cimon's foreign policy was staunchly pro-Spartan. He named one of his sons Lacedaemonius, literally Spartan, to signal his allegiance. He argued that Athens and Sparta should cooperate to dominate Greece together rather than compete for supremacy. This put him at odds with the rising democratic faction led by Ephialtes and Pericles, who saw Sparta as Athens' inevitable enemy. The crisis came in 462 BC, when Sparta faced a massive Helot revolt. The Helots were Sparta's enslaved population, far outnumbering the Spartan citizens. When they rebelled and fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, Sparta's military situation became desperate. Sparta requested Athenian military assistance. Cimon urged the assembly to help. According to Plutarch, he argued that Athens shouldn't allow Greece to become lame or let Athens lose its yokefellow. The assembly, swayed by Cimon's influence, voted to send 4,000 hoplites to aid Sparta. But when the Athenian force arrived, the Spartans became suspicious. They feared that democratic Athenians might sympathize with the rebellious Helots. In a humiliating dismissal, Sparta sent the Athenian army home, thanking them for their offer but declining their help. This insult to Athenian honor destroyed Cimon's political credibility. His pro-Spartan policy had led directly to public humiliation. The democratic faction seized the opportunity. In 461 BC, Cimon was ostracized. But here we see the flexibility of the institution. 5 years into his exile, Athens faced a crisis. They recalled Cimon early. This proves that ostracism was not a moral condemnation. It was a strategic pause. When the strategy changed, the exile could end. The recall happened because Athens' military situation had deteriorated. Fighting wars on multiple fronts against Sparta and Persia simultaneously, Athens needed experienced generals. Cimon, despite his earlier policy failures, was a proven military commander. Pragmatism overrode factional grudges. This flexibility distinguishes ostracism from criminal punishment. A convicted criminal serves a fixed sentence regardless of changing circumstances. But ostracism was purely political. If the political calculus shifted, so could the exile's status. This made ostracism more humane than execution, but also more cynical. You weren't punished for evil deeds, but for political inconvenience. Other victims followed similar patterns. Megacles, son of Hippocrates, from the powerful Alcmaeonid family, was ostracized in 486 BC. Xanthippus, father of Pericles, was ostracized in 484, but recalled to command the Greek fleet at Mycale in 479. Each case reveals factional conflict, not criminal justice. What's striking is how many of these men returned to prominence after their exile. Ostracism didn't destroy political careers permanently, it merely interrupted them. This suggests that Athenian democracy, for all its volatility, recognized the value of experienced leadership, even when that leadership had become temporarily intolerable. The institution of ostracism functioned reasonably well for roughly 70 years. But like all political systems, it was susceptible to gaming. Its death knell came in 417 BC, during the chaos of the Peloponnesian War. By this point, Athens had been at war with Sparta for 14 years. The conflict had transformed Athenian politics. The confident expansionist democracy of the mid-5th century had given way to a paranoid, faction-ridden state fighting for survival. Political discourse had coarsened. Leaders no longer competed over grand strategies, but over how to avoid defeat. The city was bitterly divided between two leaders. On one side was Nicias, the older, cautious conservative who wanted peace. On the other was Alcibiades, the young, flamboyant, reckless aristocrat who wanted to expand the war to Sicily. Nicias represented the exhausted majority. According to Thucydides, he was personally wealthy and used his fortune for public liturgies, funding festivals and triremes to maintain popularity. He was deeply religious, consulting oracles before major decisions. He believed Athens had overextended itself and needed to consolidate its empire before Sparta could destroy it. His great achievement was negotiating the Peace of Nicias in 421 BC, a treaty that temporarily ended the war. But the peace was fragile, undermined by allies on both sides who refused to honor its terms. By 417, it was clear the peace wouldn't last. Alcibiades was Nicias's opposite in every way. Young, beautiful, brilliant, and utterly without scruples, Alcibiades embodied both the best and worst of Athenian democracy. He was related to Pericles, trained by Socrates, and possessed of charisma that made him nearly irresistible to the demos. But Alcibiades was also spectacularly self-destructive. He kept 7 chariots for racing at Olympia, flaunting wealth on a scale that made even other aristocrats uncomfortable. He conducted affairs with married women openly, including allegedly with the wife of the Spartan king during his later exile in Sparta. He changed political allegiances as easily as he changed lovers. Alcibiades argued for an aggressive expansion of the war. Specifically, he advocated for the Sicilian expedition, a massive invasion of Sicily to conquer Syracuse and bring the wealthy island under Athenian control. This would provide resources to defeat Sparta decisively. The tension was unbearable. The assembly voted to hold an ostracism. Everyone knew it was a duel. One of the two titans would go. It was to be the ultimate showdown of ideologies. The entire city understood the stakes. If Nicias won, Athens would pursue peace, accept limits, focus on preserving what it had. If Alcibiades won, Athens would gamble everything on expansion, risking total victory or catastrophic defeat. The ostracism would decide not just who stayed in Athens, but what kind of power Athens would try to be. Political factions mobilized. Wealthy patrons funded propaganda. The agora buzzed with debate and intrigue. Bets were placed on the outcome. Everything pointed to a historic confrontation. But something unexpected happened. According to Plutarch, Nicias and Alcibiades, at realizing that the vote was too close to call and that either could be destroyed, made a secret backroom deal. They instructed their respective political factions, their voting blocs, not to vote against each other, but to combine their votes against a third man. This reveals the factional nature of Athenian politics at its most cynical. Both Nicias and Alcibiades controlled enough votes to determine the outcome. They had mobilized their supporters, distributed pre-written ostraca, prepared for battle. But when faced with mutual destruction, they chose mutual preservation. The logic was coldly rational. If Nicias was ostracized, Alcibiades would face no restraint on his adventurism. If Alcibiades was ostracized, Nicias would face no opposition to his defeatism. Better for both to remain and continue their rivalry within the city than risk giving either faction total control. That man was Hyperbolus. Hyperbolus was a demagogue, a lamp seller, a man often mocked in the comedies of Aristophanes. But he was not a threat to the state. He was a nuisance, not a tyrant. Hyperbolus represented a new kind of politician in Athenian democracy. He wasn't from an aristocratic family. He made his money in trade, selling lamps. He rose to prominence through skill in public speaking and by championing the interests of the lower classes against the aristocracy. The comic poets hated him. Aristophanes mocked him repeatedly, calling him a foreigner, suggesting his mother was a prostitute, accusing him of cowardice and corruption. These attacks probably had little basis, in fact. They were standard aristocratic contempt for anyone who gained power without proper breeding. Hyperbolus had actually advocated for the ostracism, hoping it would eliminate Alcibiades and leave him as the leading voice for aggressive war policy. He badly miscalculated. He didn't understand that Nicias and Alcibiades, despite their rivalry, had more in common with each other than either had with him. They were both aristocrats. Hyperbolus was not. When forced to choose, class solidarity trumped ideological difference. When the shards were counted, Nicias was safe. Alcibiades was safe. Hyperbolus was banished. The city was stunned. The educational theatre of ostracism had been turned into a farce. The weapon designed to cut down the tallest poppy had been used to weed out a dandelion. The immediate reaction was shock and laughter. But how had this happened? The two men everyone expected to face off had colluded to exile a third man nobody feared. The sacred ritual designed to protect democracy from tyranny had been hacked by cynical politicians protecting themselves. The comic poet Plato, not the philosopher, wrote, "The punishment was too good for the poor wretch. The ostracon was not invented for such as he." This line captures the essence of the scandal. Ostracism was meant for the powerful, the dangerous, the potentially tyrannical. It was a weapon against greatness turned threatening. To use it against Hyperbolus, a man of no distinguished family and limited real power, was to debase the institution itself. Other contemporary sources echo this disgust. According to Plutarch, one observer remarked that Hyperbolus's ostracism didn't exile him from Athens so much as it exiled honor from ostracism. The institution couldn't recover from this humiliation. The Athenians were so disgusted by this manipulation, so ashamed that their sacred ritual had been hacked by political collusion, that they never used ostracism again. The institution died not because it was cruel, but because it had become ridiculous. The last ostracism happened in 417 BC. The mechanism remained technically legal for decades afterward. The assembly could still vote to hold an ostracism, but they never did. The Hyperbolus affair had destroyed the institution's credibility beyond repair. This tells us something profound about political legitimacy. Institutions don't survive on legal authority alone. They require public belief in their purpose and integrity. When that belief evaporates, the institution becomes a hollow shell, regardless of its continued legal existence. The death of ostracism had consequences. Athens lost its primary non-violent mechanism for resolving factional disputes. The next major political crisis, the oligarchic coup of 411 BC, was resolved through violence rather than voting. The democratic restoration that followed relied on executions and confiscations rather than exile. Politics became more brutal precisely because the safety valve had been broken. It is tempting to look at ostracism and see the ancient ancestor of cancel culture. The parallels are certainly there. The mob judgment, the lack of formal trial, the exile from the community based on public opinion rather than legal statute. Both ostracism and modern cancellation operate on similar principles. They empower ordinary people to participate in punishing the powerful. They bypass formal legal systems in favor of direct popular action. They create fear through unpredictability. Anyone could become a target. And they claim to protect community values against those who violate them. The mechanics even rhyme. Ancient Athenians would gather in the agora, scratching names on pottery. Modern internet users gather on social media platforms, typing names in posts and tweets. Both involve mass participation, collective judgment, and the power of accumulated individual actions to destroy reputations and careers. However, this comparison misses a vital nuance. Modern cancellation is often social and economic, driven by horizontal pressure. Athenian ostracism was a state-sanctioned vertical check on power. This distinction matters enormously. Ostracism was a formal political procedure with rules, quorums, cooling-off periods, and official oversight. Cancel culture is decentralized, spontaneous, and often mob-driven with no formal structure or accountability. Ostracism targeted the powerful specifically because they were powerful. Cancel culture can target anyone regardless of their actual power. Moreover, ostracism was temporary and non-punitive in intent. The exile lasted 10 years, then ended. Property wasn't confiscated. Families weren't punished. The exile could return and resume political life. Modern cancellation rarely offers such clear pathways to redemption. The stain can last indefinitely. The Athenians recognized a truth that modern democracies often struggle with: that massive inequality in influence is incompatible with true equality in citizenship. They believed that if one man becomes so loud that he drowns out the rest, the only solution is to remove him from the room. This is perhaps ostracism's most challenging insight for modern democracies. We generally accept that inequality of wealth, talent, or charisma is natural and even beneficial. We celebrate exceptional individuals. We build systems that reward distinction. But the Athenians worried that exceptional individuals, however deserving of their success, threatened the democratic equality that allowed everyone else to participate meaningfully in politics. If one man's voice is amplified 1,000 times through wealth, family connections, or personal magnetism, does everyone else really have equal voice? Modern democracies address this through various means: campaign finance laws, term limits, anti-monopoly regulations. But we rarely consider simply removing the too powerful individual from the political arena temporarily to let the system rebalance. We lack ostracism's confidence that such removal could be non-punitive and reversible. But the failure of ostracism, the Hyperbolus affair, teaches us a different lesson. It teaches us that mechanisms designed to protect democracy can easily be weaponized by those savvy enough to manipulate the rules. When judicial processes become popularity contests, justice inevitably yields to strategy. This is ostracism's warning to modern democracies. Any mechanism powerful enough to check tyranny is powerful enough to be abused by tyrannical majorities. The same tool that protects democratic equality can be turned against democracy's marginal voices. The weapon aimed at the tallest poppies can be redirected toward any flower the powerful find inconvenient. The last ostracism happened over 2,400 years ago. The shards lie in museum drawers, catalogued and numbered. But the questions they pose remain unanswered. How does a free society protect itself from those who would use its freedoms to destroy it? And at what point does the protection of democracy become the tyranny of the majority? These questions haunt every democracy. The ancient Athenians developed one answer: empower the people to exile the dangerous before danger becomes tyranny. It worked for 70 years, removing genuine threats to democratic stability. Then it failed spectacularly when cynical politicians turned it into a tool for factional advantage. Modern democracies face the same dilemma with different mechanisms. We have impeachment, recall elections, term limits, and constitutional checks on power. We have investigative journalism, social media accountability, and yes, cancel culture. Each is designed to check power and protect democratic values. Each can be manipulated by those with resources and strategic sophistication. Aristides the Just wrote his own name on a shard of pottery to satisfy a tired peasant. In doing so, he validated the very system that exiled him. He accepted that the will of the community, no matter how arbitrary, was the supreme law. This moment, perhaps apocryphal, captures something essential about democratic faith. Aristides didn't argue that the system was unjust because it punished him despite his virtue. He didn't claim that his service to Athens entitled him to immunity from the demos' judgment. He accepted the verdict of his fellow citizens, even when that verdict was manifestly unfair. This requires a kind of political humility almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. We instinctively believe that individuals have rights the majority cannot override, that justice matters more than democracy, that being right should protect us from being punished. Aristides apparently believed none of these things. He believed in the sovereignty of the demos absolutely. Whether that is a noble sacrifice or a cautionary tale about the dangers of collective madness is a judgment history has left to us. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Aristides' acceptance of democratic authority, even when exercised badly, was necessary to make Athenian democracy function at all. Perhaps his willingness to be unjustly exiled paradoxically protected justice by preventing the spiral into civil conflict that would have followed resistance. Or perhaps his sacrifice reveals the fundamental flaw in radical democracy, that it demands individuals surrender their rights completely to collective will, making tyranny inevitable even if the tyrant wears the mask of the majority. The ostraka in museum drawers cannot answer this question. They can only remind us that 25 centuries ago, a different civilization struggled with the same problems we face today. They found one answer. It worked until it didn't. We're still searching for ours. If exploring how past societies understood justice interests you, Historical Justice releases similar documentaries every Tuesday and Saturday. Subscribe to continue this examination of how civilizations have addressed crime, punishment, and social order across the centuries. Thank you for watching Historical Justice.